Hi there, my name is Giles Crosse and I am ISEAL Associate Manager for Content Strategy. And in today's podcast, I'm talking with Kristin Komives about the urgency of GHG emissions and climate action, and how credible voluntary action can help guide us through today's uncertain times. Perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself, Kristin, and then we can dive into our questions.
Sure. Thanks, Giles. I'm Kristin Komives. I'm the Director of Programs at ISEAL, and I also lead our work on climate here.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I wonder if we can start by touching on some relatively broad but massively important themes around what you feel might be today's most pressing climate challenge.
I think that's a trick question in a way, because the tricky thing about climate is that climate change affects weather, it affects temperatures, it affects sea level rise, but those in turn affect basically every other environmental system and every other human system. So there isn't, I would say, one specific most important climate emergency we need to pay attention to. It's the fact that we have this growing change across many, many systems, which has effects on basically everything we do.
Okay, that's interesting. It sounds like you're touching on the kind of overarching elements that draw all these challenges together, rather than there necessarily being one thing which we should be focusing on so much. Is there anything that's more specific on why addressing climate challenges is so urgent overall? Or again, do you feel it would be quite a kind of broad brush approach to touch on all the key factors?
Well, again, because climate change underlies change in so many other systems, I think that is a reason enough to say that it's a problem that we need to take seriously. But I also take your broader point that we really need to avoid just thinking only about climate as a separate thing and as the most important thing, because it should be an underlying element of our work on many other topics as well.
It's fascinating, kind of the interplay between the big top climate level things and then the actual work that goes on behind them. Moving that on to credibility a bit, and ISEAL's work in the credibility space. Obviously, this is a massive thing for ISEAL. Can you tell me a little bit about how credibility drives ambitious commitment to climate impact? And maybe the focus on ambitious here, perhaps, rather than the fact that we're aware of climate and impact and what needs to happen, perhaps we can zone in on exactly what our ambitions are here and what credibility has to do in that kind of space.
Credible action on any kind of sustainability issues has a number of different dimensions, right? And one of them really is a focus on impact. So saying we're going to make a difference on the most important issues is an important element of any kind of credible action. The other part of that is also thinking about how what you do is going to be measured, and that you have some kind of practical approach to actually making a difference. So if you think about all those elements together, that enables us to make ambitious commitments. So we need to be ambitious because we need to focus on making a difference, but we also need to know that we can really do something, and we need to be able to measure it. And if you can do all those things, then we can make ambitious commitments. So companies that are sticking their necks out and making ambitious commitments on things like this really need to know that they have a way forward, a credible way forward to actually coming into compliance or reaching their own objectives.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's something I picked up when you mentioned the sustainability metrics and reporting, and just how strong the evidence base always is that drives what we actually do. Is there anything else to touch on, just on the measurement side of climate impact and credibility?
I'm a strong believer in measurement. I come from a research background. I come from an M&E background. So I believe that information, if well used, can make a really big difference. First of all, it helps us understand what the problem is, where we currently stand, and it, of course, helps us track progress. I think there is a danger, however, that we can get so caught up in the weeds of how to do good measurement that all of our energy goes there, or, and we don't actually do the work. Then we just focus on the measurement side. So although I'm a strong proponent of measurement, I think it should be measurement accompanying a strong program of action.
Yeah, it can be very easy to get tied up in a lot of metrics.
And I would say that the big drivers of action right now in the climate space, there's legislation that's driving action, and there are also frameworks like an SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, that have received a lot of attention and a lot of uptake from companies setting really ambitious science-based targets. So these are drivers of action. But something like the Science-Based Targets Initiative assumes that you set a really credible target, but also that you are tracking your progress towards meeting that target. So I would say that the frameworks that are driving a lot of climate action today very much rely on there being good measurement, good methodologies, good reporting, credible information out there. So that is why I think measurement and reporting and data and metrics are also important in the climate space in particular. It's not that it's not important in other spaces, but it's it's very important in climate.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes very good sense. Maybe if we move on to sustainability systems a bit more specifically in this space, then I'd be fascinated to understand what sustainability systems themselves are doing to be credible on GHG emissions and the monitoring and reporting that they're up to as well. So I guess maybe if you could give me a kind of broad overview of where sustainability systems are at with the GHG emissions side and monitoring and reporting, that'd be a really good place to start.
Sure. Well, first I'll say that it's a topic of great interest within the ISEAL membership, and I would say the vast majority of organizations, so we have nearly 50 members, the vast majority of organizations are all working in some way or another on emissions measurement and reporting. I would say that there are three types of groups of standards systems out there. We have, first of all, there are those who are in the climate space, right? They exist to certify good practice on something related to climate. And obviously, these systems have the whole concept of GHG emissions very baked into their whole approach. Then we have other systems that are certifying a product or a process or a piece of infrastructure or something like this, where they are metrics-based systems, meaning the requirements and the standards themselves actually are that something meets a particular metric or doesn't surpass a particular quantitative target or something like that. Those systems have, as part of the standard process and the compliance process, they have measurement built in already, often also on GHG emissions, amongst other things.
Sure.
And then we have standards that are more focused on a particular product or the activities that need to happen to be sustainable in relation to that product or process or factory or farm or whatever. And so the requirements are not about meeting a particular quantitative measure, but even these systems have supportive monitoring and evaluation frameworks that are tracking performance measurement on GHG as well. So they may have started from different places, I would say, but the vast majority of sustainability systems we work with today are all working in some way on improving their GHG measurement and therefore using that information to support, for example, corporate reporting.
Okay, great. I think that's a really good overview. I think it's fascinating, and it's worth touching on the fact that everyone's going to be at different stages in this journey, right? And everyone's working in such different sectors that it's unlikely, I would imagine, to necessarily always find that the same story fits every sustainability system out there. But I wonder if this speaks to credibility a bit, because my next question was going to be about what sustainability systems are doing to be credible on these emissions.
One of the foundational concepts in credibility is that you are making a difference, right? So it's what the impact is. So, so all of these systems that I'm talking about have a theory of change, have actions, have requirements that are really aimed at making a difference on emissions. So leading to lower emissions, for example. So there's that as the basis. And then there are other elements of credibility around the process of collecting and sharing and reporting information and what you do with that. So things like whether you have a system that will deliver reliable information, whether you have truthful claims based on that.
Sure.
That is something that is really important to us as ISEAL, but also something that all of our members are working on. So not just doing the reporting of a particular metric, but how to make that system better, more reliable, more transparent about methodology, for example. All of those are elements of credibility that I would say all of the systems are working on, regardless of where they are in their journey or how they got into the journey of measuring GHG emissions.
I guess now might be a good time to touch on some of the challenges that they're facing too, and what the difficulties are for sustainability systems in the monitoring and reporting and the GHG sides.
Sure, yeah. So some of the challenges that they face are not unlike the challenges that anyone who's trying to do GHG emissions measurement in the climate space faces. So there are problems, for example, with availability and quality of data, particularly secondary data. The sustainability systems may be collecting primary data from all of the factories or farms that they're working on, but in order to feed the models that generate the emissions estimates, you also need to have other reference data, let's say. And they find that there are still problems with that and much needs to be improved in terms of the availability of this data. So that's one common problem. Another type of problem is more one of who is benefiting from all of this work that's being done on emissions measurement. Clearly, sustainability systems want to be a good support for companies who are buying, say, certified products. They want to help those companies be able to report on the impact that buying certified products has on their footprints, for example. So they are working very hard on that. But they also are interested in making sure that the factories and farms and forest managers who are doing the changes on the ground in order to generate these improvements are somehow benefiting from making all of this information available. It takes effort, and there are costs associated with making the changes on the ground that are needed.
Of course,
Is there a way that we can use and leverage the information that's being provided in order to bring more value back to those producers? So that is one of those, I guess, strategic questions that a lot of sustainability systems are struggling with. And through the ISEAL Innovation Fund, many are testing out different approaches to how they could do that, whether it's from strengthening data ownership or devising new kinds of credit models, or unlocking carbon credits or payment for environmental services. So there are many things being tested in that front.
Would it be a stretch to say that you feel there might be something of an innate conflict there between data ownership and the work of sustainability systems and small producers, for example, and the markets, and quite where the value of the data goes compared with who is kind of tasked with providing it?
It is very easy to go about setting up these systems without thinking about who is doing the work and who is benefiting, let's say. And so I think sustainability systems have a really important role to play in trying to think about how they can ensure that there is value add for all the players involved, right? And that I'm not saying that that's easy to do, but I think it's a critical role for sustainability systems to keep this kind of concern on the table and to really try to find ways to make sure that all benefit.
Cool, that makes sense. Thanks. Maybe that brings us on to my next question, although you may feel that you've answered most of it about the challenges in this space for the systems. Is there much more to say, do you think, that we haven't just covered? Anything else? Or
I mean, in addition, I mentioned two challenges. And other challenges I would say are we're talking about a lot of data and information here, right? So the one thing that ISEAL works on with our members a lot is around data management, data quality, how to become better managers of data, because clearly this is very important, not just for GHG emissions measurement, but also for the future of so many of our sustainability programs. So that's an ongoing challenge, I would say, is how to build those systems. But there's also, and here we can get very nerdy in climate jargon, but there's a lot of the way that data, pieces of data and information pass through the supply chain, or pass through what we call chain of custody models, is very complex. And there are a lot of people who put their heads together every day to try to find ways to make sure that that happens in a credible way. So basically, it's about how do you take a lot of little pieces of data and aggregate them into some kind of summary or collective figure that a company is using for its reporting. And there's a lot of detail there that people are spending a lot of time working on. But I guess I would say this is where credibility comes in again, is that the sustainability systems, but also many others who are working on this challenge, are really looking for ways to do this credibly, to make sure that whatever companies say at the end of the day about the progress they're making or the contribution they're making is really true, right? And really represents what is happening out there.
Yeah, fantastic. That makes a lot of sense. Moving on to the drivers in the space, I guess fundamentally why sustainability systems are doing this stuff. I'd be interested to understand a bit more about the core drivers for them. There are probably some kind of obvious thoughts in terms of the markets or in terms of real world impact and causing benefits. But I'd be fascinated to get your kind of deeper insight into specifically what the drivers are, which are really, really pushing these guys to do this work.
So the fact that climate change is at the root of so many other problems, as I mentioned earlier in this talk, I think is one of the main reasons why so many sustainability systems think it's a very important part of what they want to deal with and talk about and require in their systems. So that's definitely, impact is part of it. On the measurement side in particular, I think it is the legislation and the emerging voluntary frameworks that are getting so much traction and making companies really want to find good, credible data that they can use for their own reporting, right? So that's there's a real incentive for sustainability systems to be able to provide that data and information. It's critical that products that are certified, if that means that the products are lower, have lower emissions or low carbon products, for example, then you want to be able to have that recognized in whatever reporting kind of framework that's out there. So figuring out how to enable that is a real driver.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think that's fascinating, and I think that's a good answer to the broader themes that speak to what the systems need to be doing out there at the moment. Maybe you could tell me a bit about what they have to learn in the space compared to kind of where they are already.
Well, I think it depends on whether we're talking about what we're learning about measurement and reporting, or what we're learning about making a difference on climate in general, right? Because those aren't exactly the same thing. I think on measurement and reporting, there are a lot of common challenges. I think that the strength that the sustainability systems have is really having access to and a system built up to interact with the farms, the factories, or service providers, right? So that you have this opportunity to really capture information at a very granular level, an opportunity that others don't really have. So there's some real strengths there. But I think there's still a lot to learn about how, as I mentioned, some of the technical issues of how to translate those data points into information that can be used effectively by companies much farther down the supply chain, for example. And there's still a lot of learning there. But most importantly, there's learning and innovation going on around how to make this whole endeavor worth it.
Right.
to make sure that it's actually delivering value, both in terms of delivering impact,
Yep.
that it's encouraging corporate investment, it's encouraging corporate decisions to buy products with lower emissions profiles, right? For example.
Mm.
So if those things aren't happening,
Yeah.
then a lot of the investment and measurement don't make sense. So I would say that's the area where there's still learning to be done of how do we make sure that measurement is supporting the kind of action that we really want to see on the ground.
Thanks. That makes good sense. Do you feel there's any frustration in the wider climate space? And I don't necessarily mean within sustainability systems, but clearly we've all been doing this work for some considerable time now. And we've seen some changes in terms of politics, and we've seen changes in terms of how quickly are we moving. I feel some people are frustrated with the sense of progress on climate. I just wonder if I'd be interested in your feelings on how the overall space looks and whether there's a sense, are we doing enough? Are we doing enough quickly enough? And just the overall background within which sustainability systems are trying to move forwards might be intriguing to speak a little bit about as well.
Well, I think what we've seen recently is the fact that political changes can very quickly reverse the drivers, as you asked earlier about the drivers. So it can very quickly reverse the drivers of action. And even with strong drivers, it's really hard to get enough people, enough organizations, enough companies, enough governments to move in the right direction fast enough that we hit, global targets. So when you actually have active resistance or turning the tide the wrong way, clearly we're going in the wrong direction. That is frustrating as a background, and I think it frustrates people working in this space quite a lot. On the other hand,
sure.
I think we shouldn't forget that is one of the beauties of voluntary action, right? Voluntary action isn't subject to the changes in, the political winds, right? And so there is no reason why we can't continue to move forward with credible voluntary action. Those who want to do that and who are committed to do that can continue to go forward. So that is one of the benefits of voluntary sustainability systems, is that they're steady, they move forward. So we're still going at it despite perhaps what's changing in the whole environment. We'll keep trying to move forward.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, that makes good sense, actually. I think that speaks very broadly to some of the bigger challenges out there. Do you think there's much more to say on where sustainability systems can lead in terms of their evolution and progress, either with climate reporting or just the monitoring specifically? And any sense of where they're best placed to lead, I guess, rather than necessarily be responsive?
I think that one of the real advantages that sustainability systems have is that they bring together actors along a supply chain or in a landscape or in a particular community, and can play important conveners of conversations, helping to reach consensus on what is actually feasible to do, what would be good practice, what is expected in a sector. And that role is very important if we're trying to move whole sectors forward on a problem like climate change. So I think that's definitely a place where sustainability systems can be leaders and partner with others. The other is that we've talked a lot about GHG emissions measurement now, which is clearly an important part of all the climate work. But there are other aspects of climate work that need more attention. Things like I mentioned, some of these equity issues in the implementation of climate projects and climate initiatives, but also things like adaptation and resilience, which have received less attention and support. And so I think going forward, these are other places where the sustainability systems can lead in putting these other issues on the table. Maybe finally, I'll say that most of the sustainability systems in the ISEAL Alliance look at sustainability holistically and see
Yep.
climate as one part of that, but think about the broader impact of any sort of actions that are required or recommended by the systems. And I think that's personally very important. You run the risk if you focus just on one sustainability issue of having detrimental effects or unexpected effects on other sustainability issues. So sustainability systems can be leaders in thinking about where climate fits in a holistic sustainability strategy.
Fantastic, thanks. Moving to stuff towards the kind of sense of smart mix and that kind of elements. Do you think there's work that sustainability systems can do that maybe mandatory measures or the corporates are less well placed to do?
Government regulation is about rules.
Mm,
Sustainability systems do a lot more than set rules, as I mentioned, right? There are other important rules that play as sector conveners, as pushing the dialogue, et cetera. So I think their sustainability systems have a broader role.
mhm.
In relation to corporates, companies can set up programs that are similar to sustainability systems. They can have codes of conduct. They can have
Yeah, yeah.
their own verification systems, et cetera. But these can be subject to criticism because they are not independently verified or independently assured. So one of the
Yeah.
things that sustainability systems can offer both to governments and to corporates is this idea of being an independent assurer or verifier of progress or information that brings a kind of transparency and some independence that can be really helpful in terms of mitigating risks and
Mhm. Yeah,
showing
yeah.
like true commitment.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. I think we were going to talk about how sustainability systems, voluntary frameworks drive climate leadership. I think maybe you've answered that question already, unless there's anything
So yeah.
specific to add.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's worth pointing out that
Mm,
many of the voluntary frameworks that are driving climate action are
mm.
sustainability systems, right?
Yeah, yeah,
They
yeah.
set requirements for the climate space. They have multi-stakeholder input into those requirements. They do some kind of checking
Mm,
of action or targets or other things against them. So they are actually part of the sustainability system space. And I think that's really important to recognize that we have this voluntary actors and voluntary frameworks and systems
yeah,
that
yeah.
are really shaping a lot of the the direction for climate action.
Mhm. Fantastic. Thank you. We were going to talk about what the market's desires on GHG emissions and reporting, and governments and businesses, and maybe what governments want from sustainability systems on GHG. So perhaps we can put all those themes together into one, and you could just speak a little bit to those questions.
Yeah. So specifically on the measurement and reporting framework, I think
Hmm.
everyone is looking for quality, reliable data and
Yeah,
for
yeah.
credible claims, right? So, to the extent that sustainability systems can deliver those things, then I think that they are a real help to
Mhm.
all of these actors. The market's looking for it, but also specific government actors are looking for it. One challenge is that many of the emerging government regulations at the moment are not very clear yet on
Mm.
exactly what role sustainability systems can play and how they would be recognized within legislation or as
Okay.
supporting legislative
Yeah,
compliance. So
yeah.
that's the kind of question that we are trying to work with um, government policymakers on is how can
Mhm.
we make sure that sustainability systems can provide as much support as possible for the implementation of the emerging legislation.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. Would there be much to say about what would differentiate a credible approach to GHG emissions from an approach which might be slightly less credible? I feel we've touched on credibility already, but sometimes it's good to be very clear about what we consider a more credible approach to one that is perhaps not so far down the line?
Yeah. So how to look for a credible approach? I mean, the ISO credibility principles give a lot of indication of what to look for, but just to name a few things, I think transparency is really important. So if you can't
Yeah,
find
yeah.
out what methodology was used, or you don't know when or how data was collected, that's problematic. So transparency is very important.
Sure.
Um, Reliability and quality of what is being delivered, whether there is some kind of independence in how the information is being assessed. These are all sorts of elements of credibility that we would
Yeah.
consider. Um, I think also I mentioned early in this conversation something about how the whole process is adding value. So another dimension of credibility is whether or not we are doing things in a way that are actually driving the impact that we want. So
Yeah, yeah,
are we
sure.
setting it all up to create the right incentives? Are we setting it all up to make sure that those who do the work are benefiting? That's really important. And another element of credibility that we haven't talked so much about is collaboration. That if we're all going on our own, doing our own thing, not trying to align, not trying to work together, then the overall cost of society is much higher.
Right.
So we put a lot of value also in trying to build on what's there, trying to work together in a way that will improve efficiency and ultimately the impact of what we're trying to do.
Is there much to say about, I guess, the opportunity for governments or corporate leaders when it comes to GHG emissions?
Well, I think if we look more broadly than just GHG emissions, I think the real
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
opportunity for corporates from thinking about climate and having work on climate, including GHG emissions, is
Mm,
thinking about what the long-term horizon is for their business, right? So
yeah,
I
yeah,
mentioned at the
thank you.
start how much climate change is changing so many aspects of our natural and human systems, and that will have long-term effects on sustainability of supply or
hmm
the health of ecosystems on which so many businesses rely, et cetera. So there are good long-term reasons for investing in
Yeah, yeah.
GHG emissions reduction. The problem is that the action of one company doesn't only benefit that company, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's action benefits everyone. And therefore, it's harder to make this strict business case just on that point. So you have to buy
Yeah.
into the idea that we all need to do our part. There are, of course, other aspects of climate action, like adaptation, where you
hmm
can argue that very specifically, investing in helping with adaptation in a location where your business is located or where you are
Mm,
looking for
mm,
supply of products is really important to the long-term viability of your business. So paying attention to climate in a broad sense, there's a really good business case for that.
fantastic. Yeah. I was going to ask you about a little bit about 1.5 degrees C and just in practical terms, what's been going on in the last few months, reporting that we've kind of pushed through that boundary. And I guess whether that necessarily triggers any more action on GHG, whether it triggers more urgency, or is that just kind of a number now? And we all
Mm.
knew it was kind of coming. And does it really change the work that's happening or hasten the urgency of what we need to do?
I think this goes back to the point that we made at the start of this conversation about the
Yeah,
power,
yeah.
but also the weakness of numbers and metrics and
Right. Yeah,
measurement.
yeah.
So 1.5 is a very meaningful and powerful target, which was
Mm,
capable of generating a lot of action and collaboration around action to try to avoid hitting that target.
yeah.
But the reality is that 1.5 is not a magic number. I mean, 1.6,
Mm,
1.7, 1.8, they
yeah.
all have their consequences. What we definitely know is 2 degrees is better than 2.5 degrees, and 1.5 is better than 2. So we
Yeah.
shouldn't let the fact that we hit or pass a target stop us from continuing to
Mm,
act. I think the question more is, if we feel like this is old news, do we need to have another
mm,
device of some sort, another global target to motivate all of us, right? Because that can often be quite motivating. And again, this is why measurement and target setting is so important. It has the potential to create motivation and incentive. So we don't want to lose that by saying we've passed the target. But
Absolutely.
It certainly doesn't mean we should stop with the action.
Yeah, of course. That all makes good sense. Thanks. I often like to, we've pretty much hit our time. I often like to finish up with maybe a more controversial question. I was interested to understand what your opinion personally, or even the wider ISEAL opinion, might be on carbon offsetting. I guess related to 1.5, and there's been so much controversy about carbon offsets down the years. I often feel it's nice just to branch out into a wider space at the end of these chats, and I'd be intrigued to hear if you've got any opinions on offsets and just where they sit in the wider kind of mix of what everyone's trying to do here, perhaps to wrap up our chat on these themes.
So there are basically two big concerns about offsets, right? One concern is that the offsets themselves are meaningless, meaning that the projects and activities behind them are actually not driving any emissions reduction. And the other is that the way that offsets are being used in carbon accounting and progress accounting is allowing companies to step away from doing something themselves in their own supply chain and instead just buying, let's say, offsets. On the first point, that is the whole point of credibility, right? Is really trying to have credible systems for designing, checking offsets and methodologies, for looking at research to understand what types of offsets are likely to have more of an effect, where might things go wrong, et cetera. So I would say it's not that all offsets are perfect, but there is research out there. There are standard systems out there that are trying to help identify the most valuable type of projects. The second point of how they're used, on this point as well, my personal opinion, and again, this is in my personal opinion, is that you don't want to have purchase of offsets be a reason not to take other action. But from the research that we've done at ISEAL, we find no real evidence that that is happening. That companies are stopping taking other action because they are buying offsets. Maybe there'll be evidence to that in the future, but at the moment there's little evidence to that. So if that isn't happening, then I don't think we should discourage companies from both taking action within their supply chain and on top of that buying offsets. It's just a question of how you look at that in the overall accounting and the way you set up, the approaches to target setting and making progress towards targets. So I would say offsets are not per se bad, let's say. It's a question of how you use them and how they're set up and how they're managed, what kind of oversight there is.
Brilliant, thanks. I think that's some really useful, deep insight there. It sounds like you're touching on the context of the offsets, right? Rather than necessarily saying offsets are terrible, offsets are a bad thing, And I think that's intriguing, and I think that's what ISEAL's here to do necessarily, is to lead that kind of thought and to have a balanced conversation. So I think that's a really lovely way to wrap up, actually. Thank you, Kristin.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this podcast on greenhouse gas emissions and climate. So if you have any questions or you'd like any more information at all, then just email giles@isealalliance.org. Or if you'd like to learn more about ISEAL, or indeed credible sustainability systems, then just go to www.iseal.org.